It's 1990. You and your spouse are looking at homes in Adelaide. You've done the maths. You know 34% of your hard-earned wage goes to repayments every month. It'll be hard, there'll be sacrifice, but you can do it. Fast forward, it's late November 2025. 34 degrees, you and your partner stand shoulder to shoulder in a crowd at the front of a very average home. You're both drenched in sweat, and it's not just the heat. This house, if you manage to afford it, will cost you 70% of your income a month. 70%. After food, utilities, there's no margin for error. This won't just be hard, it's borderline impossible. This is the story of how Australian affordability broke, not in a crisis, not overnight, but through 40 years of choices that had winners who watched their asset prices soar and losers who are only now doing the maths. Can someone earning the average Australian wage today afford to buy a home? The answer, as of right now, is no. Not in a single capital city in Australia. Not even close. And that's not opinion, it's arithmetic. So we have three questions. Why did housing go from expensive to mathematically impossible for most people? Why did raising interest rates, the tool designed to fix this, actually make things worse for renters and first home buyers? And how did we get here in the first place? Because this didn't happen overnight. And the real story starts decades before the RBA pulled a lever. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are genuinely alarming. In 1990, the average Australian home cost roughly 4 times the average annual household income. That's the benchmark economists use for a functioning housing market. 4 times income? Stretched. It's manageable, for sure, but 2025, the national median multiple, the same ratio, sat at 8.2. Sydney clocked in at 10.1. That means the median Sydney home cost more than 10 years of the median household's entire pre-tax income. Every dollar saved for a decade before you even get to eat. And it gets worse. A decade ago, that Sydney ratio was around 6. So in 10 years, it got 60% more severe. The share of Australian homes that a medium income household can actually afford to buy is now 14%. 3 years ago, it was 43%. It now takes the average Australian 11 years to save a 20% deposit. The average, that's not anyone earning millions of dollars, that's a couple both on 60,000. For renters, and about a third of Australians rent, 33 cents in every dollar of pre-tax income now goes to the landlord. That's a record. National rents have surged roughly 43% in 5 years. That's not a housing problem. This is an affordability crisis that spans housing, food, energy, transport all at once. Housing, I think, is one of the starkest signals, so that's where I'm going to spend my time in today's video. But the mechanism underneath applies to all of them. In the early 1980s, home ownership rates among the 25 to 34-year-old age bracket in Australia sat at 56%. By 2011, it had dropped to 34%, and it hasn't recovered. An entire generation's relationship to wealth, security, and retirement has been quietly restructured. Not by a crisis, not by a crash, but by a slow and largely invisible policy failure that played out over 40 years. The people who benefited were also the people with the loudest political voice. Homeowners are voters. Existing property owners benefit directly when supply stays restricted and prices stay high. The incentive structure for politicians to fix the problem, it's never been strong because fixing it means making assets cheaper. And in Australia, the people who vote in the most reliable numbers have most of their net worth sitting in their home. This is worth sitting with. The housing affordability crisis is not a market failure in the pure sense. It is partly a designed outcome. zoning restrictions, negative gearing tax advantages for investors, the 50% capital gains discount introduced in 1999, each of these were choices. They had winners, and for 40 years, those winners, they kept making the choices. And then, fast forward to just a few months ago, May 2026, that has cracked. One budget night, the 12th, the government moved on both levers at once. Negative gearing on established homes, restricted to new builds only. Gone for anyone buying after that night. Late June, the bill had passed both houses of parliament. For the first time in a generation, the people, the winners, who'd been making the choices didn't get to keep making them. But read the fine print, because this is where it matters. Everyone who already owns it is grandfathered, so the rules haven't changed for them. New rules don't even start until July 2027, and nothing in them lays a single brick. They change which investors want to buy what, they don't build houses. Whether that blends the affordability line or just reshuffles who wins is the opening question of the next few years. For the couple standing at the auction in 2025, it's changed nothing on that day. Because here's what's still true right now. A solo worker earning the average Australian full-time wage today cannot purchase a typical house in any capital city. Not one of them. They also cannot afford a medium-priced apartment in Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, or Perth. This is not a tough market. It is structural exclusion. 4 economic mechanisms running simultaneously that have a big effect on the affordability of housing. And understanding all 4 is what separates the headline from the actual analysis. Now, the first one, and a common one on this channel, price inelasticity of supply. Alfred Marshall, writing in 1890, gave us the formal framework for price elasticity, the idea that supply should respond to demand. When something gets expensive, more of it should be produced. That's how markets self-correct. Housing doesn't work that way. Land, it's a fixed asset. You can't manufacture more of it. Zoning laws determine what can be built where. Construction timelines run 3 to 7 years. Council approval can add years beyond that. The supply side of housing is deeply inelastic. It cannot respond quickly, and in many cases, it cannot respond at all. In Sydney, between 2013 and 2023, population grew by roughly 800,000 people. Over the same period, approval for new dwellings fell well short of what was needed. More demand, constrained supply, prices go up. That's not a housing crisis, that's a basic supply curve responding as it should. Why we built the system to stop it from correcting. Irving Fisher formalized purchasing power theory in the 20th century. The idea that what matters is not your nominal wage, but what it actually buys. Real wages, not nominal ones. Here's where the Australian story takes a quiet turn that most people miss. Up until the 1980s, productivity growth and wage growth moved together. Workers produced more, they got paid more. That relationship held for decades. And it underpinned the idea that each generation would be materially better off than the last. From the 1980s onwards, that link began to weaken. Unionisation in Australia fell from around 46% of the workforce in 1986 to 14% in 2020. The gig economy, of course, eroded bargaining power further. Meanwhile, the gains from higher productivity flowed increasingly to profits, to asset prices, and to the owners of capital, including property. Real wages in 2022 and in 2023 actually fell in Australia as inflation outpaced wage growth. People were earning more dollars and buying less. The purchasing power of an ordinary wage was quietly eroding across the board on rent, groceries, and energy. Now, this is where it can get a bit counterintuitive. And if you've watched a few of our episodes previously on rate cuts, some of this will be familiar. Richard Catalonian, writing in 1730, was the first economist to identify that money doesn't land evenly. When financial conditions change, the effects flow to some people before others, let's say. The people closest to the source benefit first. The people furthest away, generally the lower socioeconomic poor people, they feel the downside last. So this is exactly what happened in Australia between 2020 and 2023. When the RBA cut interest rates to near zero during COVID, it was trying to stimulate the economy. What it also did was make borrowing almost free. And people with assets, particularly property at that time, used that cheap money to buy more assets. Prices predictably surged. By 2022, the national home values had risen roughly 28% in 2 years. Then rates went up. Hard and fast, the RBA's tool for cooling inflation raised the cost of new mortgages dramatically. For existing homeowners with fixed rates, manageable, for a time at least. For renters trying to buy, the deposit requirement stayed enormous, and now the repayments on the mortgage became even less affordable than they were before. The rate rise hit the people with the least the hardest. The people with assets were already inside the fence. While researching this, here's a number that stopped me. In Adelaide, not Sydney, not Melbourne, which usually, they hog the spotlight, monthly mortgage repayments now consume around 70% of the median wage. In 1990, these same repayments on the same median home in the same city took 34% of the median wage. City didn't change, jobs didn't disappear, the people didn't stop working. The ratio just doubled and then it kept climbing. That's not a cost of living problem. That's a structural shift in who gets to own the place they live and who doesn't. What does a society look like when the primary vehicle for wealth accumulation becomes heritable rather than earnable? That's not a hypothetical, it's the actual trajectory that we are now on. There's a version of Australia already forming where the wealth gap doesn't get solved, it simply gets passed down. The home becomes the asset that moves between generations. The people without that inheritance are structurally locked out, not just of housing, but of the wealth accumulation that housing has represented for 50 years. For most of the last, let's say 2 decades, the government response was demand side, help more people buy. First home buyer schemes, deposit guarantees, shared equity arrangements, all these things serve to pump up the existing market. The problem is that every demand side intervention without corresponding supply creates more buyers competing for the same number of homes. The IMF and the Grattan Institute have both flagged that these schemes, without supply reform, push prices higher and transfer the problem forward. The 2026 tax change breaks that pattern to an extent. It's the first move in years aimed at the investor side of the ledger rather than the buyer side. But even there, the lever is incentive, not construction. Tilting investors towards new builds only matters if new builds actually, get built. And the market did finally turn in 2026. But watch what turned. After 3 rate hikes and a budget that spooked investors, prices in Sydney and Melbourne slipped back to their late 2025 peak. A couple of percent. While potential buyers celebrate this very mild dip, rents kept climbing and vacancies sat at record lows. A cynical dip of a couple of percent doesn't touch a structural ratio of 8 times income, and the people renting while they wait, they get squeezed harder and harder. And a falling market and an affordable one, they're not the same thing. And that's the hardest story. Australia needs to build roughly 225,000 new dwellings a year through to 2034 to close that gap. In 2024, completions fell well short, planning reform, zoning changes, infrastructure investment in outer suburbs. These are the structural levers. They take political will and realistic time horizons that don't fit electoral cycles at all. The wild card here is demographic. Australia's population keeps growing through migration. more people need housing. If supply doesn't accelerate meaningfully, the ratio climbs and the inheritance question becomes the defining economic story of the next few generations. Go back to March 2022 for a second. The RBA raised rates to fight inflation. That was the stated goal. Protect purchasing power, protect affordability in the broadest sense for the people already inside the systems with homes, assets. The mission accomplished. Inflation eased. Prices, they stabilized. For the 1/3 of Australians who rent, for the first home buyers, for the 25-year-olds running the deposit mass, the mechanism designed to help them was the same mechanism pricing them out. Rates up, repayments, they're up, deposit targets growing, wages are well behind. The affordability crisis isn't a failure of the economy to produce enough. Australia is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. This is a failure of distribution, of who captures the gains when the economy grows and who absorbs the cost when the tools are deployed to stabilize it. The next time someone tells you affordability is a personal finance problem, remember it now takes 11 years to save a deposit on the average wage. That's not a budgeting issue. That's pure arithmetic of a system working as it was designed to work. That's it for today's video. Honestly, the number in this one that hit me the hardest wasn't the Sydney 10 times ratio. That gets trotted out all the time. It was Adelaide. A city most people wouldn't put on the global housing crisis list, and repayments there take 70% of the median wage. That's when I realized this wasn't a Sydney or a Melbourne problem. It's a mechanism across the country. And here's the thing to sit with after those 2026 changes. For the first time in years, 40 years, the policy, it's actually moved. Whether it moves the number at the Adelaide auctions, that's a question we will be tracking. I want to know what surprised you most. Drop it in the comments. I'm particularly curious whether you ran the deposit mass in your own city. Next week, we are staying with the affordability crisis and we are going to tackle food. What goes in your trolley has nothing to do with farming and everything to do with currency, logistics, and a handful of trading companies most people have never heard of. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking around and watching. I appreciate you. Comment down below. I'd love to have a chat. See you in the next one.